Okay, so let's continue talking about the ideal according to Ilyenkov, which I believe is going to really, really change your life. If you read this work, and especially if you discuss it, you are going to really, really gain an amazing perspective. And this is actually the truth. It isn't just his opinion, right? So, dialectics of the ideal showcases to us how the ideal operates, how it is formed, etc. So, in the second part of this little short work, which is about 75, 80 pages long, Ilyenkov talks about how the ideal cannot be equated to consciousness or the mind. And he argues that the processes of consciousness, of course, are material. Yes, there are neurodynamic processes happening in our brain that are reaction to the outside world, but he insists that this is extremely reductive to consider this to be the source of ideal or the only ideal or the only part of the ideal, because yes, he of course acknowledges that the mind, consciousness, participates in the creation of the ideal. Without it, there won't really be an ideal if we don't have some kind of processing machine that is able to reflect back whatever happens in the material reality, then we're not going to have the ideal. And he actually argues against the cybernetic, as he calls it, interpretation. He actually calls it another school of mechanistic or mechanical or vulgar materialism, or even equates it in some of the parts of this work to idealism, the forms of idealism, which is also, he also calls it vulgar. He says that it is not like Hegelian idealism, which was basically everything was correct except that Hegel turned the ideal and material upside down, and Marx famously put everything the right side up. But Ilyenkov argues this point very, very clearly when he explains to us how the process of the ideal actually happens. Because remember, the ideal, just as the material, these are not just abstractions. These are not just words that we use to describe something that we cannot fully fathom. Rather, he argues that this is a part of a process. The material, our brain, reacts to the other material, the environment, and in this process, something happens. And this something is the ideal process. The abstractions that we make, the images that we have, the schemas that we invent in order to understand reality, all of this, he argues, is what the ideal is. However, this is not all of it. It is not just the imaginary processes, and it isn't just the processes in our mind, because of course we do act accordingly, but he also reminds us that we should not think that the ideal is only alive in other objects like pieces of art, etc. He argues that it becomes a force of itself that kind of rules over us, because all of us have all kinds of ideal reflections. We all think about the world in terms of words, pictures, colors, numbers, etc. There are differences between different people's psyches and people's nervous systems, but generally we do possess the universal ability to process information as an ideal. And then the examples that Ilyenkov provides that I think are going to be very helpful is the processes of creating art. The sculpture, for example, the process of creating the sculpture is the ideal process, because it isn't just a mechanical movement of the hand. It is guided by the understanding of how certain movements has to be accomplished, have to be done, so that the sculpture turns out to be the way it is. So the person who creates the sculpture has to guide their hand in accordance with the ideal image that they have in their mind. So this process, I believe, is very helpful. So he says the material object, hand, manipulating another material object, some kind of piece of rock, they together cannot constitute the ideal. They are a part of that process, of the ideal process, and they are regulated by this process in your mind when you envision the image of the sculpture based off of all the other sculptures that you have seen, you have been exposed to, based off of your own culture, your own socioeconomic circumstances that give rise to a certain ideal, to a certain way people relate to the world outside of themselves, etc., etc. So all of this constitutes the process of the ideal. So it cannot be reduced to simple neurodynamic processes. It cannot be reduced, just as I mentioned before, to individual psychic processes, to individual neural activity. And of course, this should be understood by anyone who has studied dialectics or Marxism somewhat seriously. But Ilyenkov has to argue this to his fellow Soviet philosophers. Unfortunately, this was the period in the 70s when the Soviet philosophy was pretty much turning into dogma. There are many reasons as to why, but Ilyenkov was trying his best to explain how the ideal is formed, how it is a process, just like anything in the dialectical world. And I think that this work is absolutely crucial to understanding the ideal, because people still refer to the ideal as some kind of ephemeral entity, something more spiritual, something that is very hard to measure and grasp. But it is, of course, not easy to fathom right away. It is not something that you can explain in 2 words, but you can still understand it when you read Ilyenkov's explanations. It all begins to fall into place. You see how, of course, the art pieces are going to bear the stamp of the ideal. This was the phrase that he famously used multiple times. But you will also be able to see all kinds of communication from another person without having to speak to them. Through art, we are able to connect to the generations of people before us. Through art, we can hear and feel things that we have never participated in. We can envision someone else's ideal because of the way they can communicate it through material reality. And this is beautiful. This provides us with the sense of belonging. And this is a necessary process for us to be able to relate better to each other and the world around us. So the ideal is not just some philosophical concept that nobody needs to explain or understand. It is the concept that helps us, is going to help us when we start building socialist projects. Inevitably, this understanding is going to help us not only understand, but make this understanding a reality. Make sure that our ideal corresponds correctly with the material, that we can see all of this communication from the past, but we can also produce the new ideal, the ideal that is going to reflect the utmost needs of humanity and not some imaginary bullshit, basically, or some imaginary stuff that we are now convinced is the reality. One more thing that Ilyenkov explains in this part of the dialectics of the ideal is the theory of value, Marxist theory of value. So if you've been struggling somewhat to understand Marxist theory of value, read this part. Of course, read the work in its entirety, but this is where Ilyenkov clarifies as to what Marx meant, because there are some misinterpretations of Marx's theory of value. And I'm not talking about bourgeois lies about it. I'm talking about the misunderstandings amongst the communists. And Ilyenkov clarifies that, yes, value is ideal. Value is absolutely the ideal. You cannot touch the value of any kind of object. You can use the object, and this is the use value of the object, but you're not going to be able to list it as its feature even. Value is absolutely ideal, and it is best seen in money, in paper money, because if paper money does not embody the ideal of value, then it is nothing. It's a useless piece of paper. So only because we're all a part of the big ideological subject, as Althusser called it, which is capitalist, only because of this, we all perceive money, this ideal form, as something of substance, as something important and necessary for the replication or reproduction of our conditions of production. So this is also very important, very interesting to read. So please go ahead and read this work. If you have already, let me know what you think. I'm going to probably make more videos about this work because I feel like it is one of the cornerstones of understanding the world nowadays. But do let me know what you think. I hope you have a great day today. Consider supporting me on Patreon. Do take care of yourself and your community first. Solidarity with all the working class people of the world. Subscribe to me in all the other social medias, even though I don't do much there. And I'll talk to you sometime later.